Hello, I'm Clare Anderson, Global Head of Schroders Family Office Service.
And I'm James Gladstone, Head of Wealth Planning.
I'm delighted to be joined by Mairi Mickel, an experienced family business advisor and consultant. Mairi brings extensive experience advising enterprising families and is an active owner and former board director of the century-old McTaggart and Mickel Group. To start, Mairi, perhaps you could tell us a bit about your experience as a fourth-generation family member.
Thank you for having me here today. So I was born into a business-owning family as the fourth generation. And so I grew up understanding that there was a brand that held my name that had a very visible profile in the city I was growing up in. I think ownership for me is about a mindset. So an owner of a family enterprise can be anything from operational owner, right in the heart of the business, to governing, through to involved owner, as I classify myself, through to somebody who's very passive and proud. So I am involved in our shareholder forums. I have a close working relationship with our chair and our operating shareholders, but I'm not on the board and I don't have an active role within the business. I'm more there to try and add value by understanding the sort of long-term thinking for my own generation and the next.
And what made you move and transition to becoming an advisor for other families?
Around 14 years ago, I had a very tough exit from my own family business during a difficult third to fourth generation leadership transition. The ownership transition had already happened. And at that time, after I left the business, I spent some time reflecting on how that could have been handled a little better. I went to America, where the family business advisory world is about 20 years ahead, and I retrained with the Family Firm Institute as a family business advisor.
So, Mairi, a subject that I'm interested in is business owners and how inextricably linked the finances are with them personally and that of the business, and your experience in terms of, is it sensible to separate those, or is it commonplace for people just to have a common financial pool between the business and them personally in terms of how they organise themselves?
I would classify that under the heading of financial hygiene. And so when I go into work with a family on a consultant basis, my first phase will always be discovery, in which I really try to get under the skin of the ownership, the business and the family. And that'll often highlight what the hygiene practices are. Is this family treating the business like their own personal piggy bank? Mm-hmm. I think in generation one, in the founding generation, and sometimes in generation two, that's very often the case with directors' loans and assets that are a little bit opaque in the form in which they are held. So over time, I think that becomes governance comes into play, and I think people are a little more specific about what belongs where and how you attribute that on the balance sheet.
Okay, well, I mean, that tends to chime with our experience, where we do see the finances of often the founder being inextricably linked in that way. And it's kind of fine when it's just the founder who's in the driving seat and running the business. Often, I think the issue arises when the next generation wants to get involved, and perhaps there is a financial strain put on the business as a result of that particular arrangement, or the next generation that wants to do something slightly different that's maybe constrained by the financial burden that sits on the business, and that can then create a bit of a conflict. So I'll be interested in your views on that, Claire, if you've come across that.
Well, I think where we see it, particularly in family office, is where the family office begins in the business. And often it can be association with finance director or somebody non-exec particularly, where they've got one foot in each camp of both family and business, and whether that is then later spun out to become a single family office or whether it continues to be embedded in the business. That's mostly where we end up seeing it.
I think what's important there, if I may overlay, is actually an understanding with the rising generation in comparison to the founding generation on mindset. Are they consumers of wealth? Yeah. Are they stewards of wealth? So sometimes it can be, if somebody's worked very, very hard from nothing to create an enormous amount of wealth, their children are growing up in an entirely different financial environment. So there can be a little bit of a conflict around what is money for. Do you find yourself having those kind of conversations with your clients?
Definitely.
Yeah, I think we definitely do. And that is the biggest challenge for the next generation, I think, to understand what is appropriate and how to behave financially, especially when the business founder or the matriarch or the patriarch is still around. So we're often having discussions with clients about what the wealth is for, the transition process to the next generation. But then it's also what do they have permission to do with that wealth? Because it's fine to have lots of wealth, but if you don't know what you're allowed to do and what decisions you're actually able to make, it can be very, very restricting. So I think that in itself is a challenge that's often solved through communication and effective communication down to the generations, to make sure that everybody knows what their position is and what they're allowed to do.
And James, the conversation for us usually begins with investable wealth. But invariably, and if you look at our client bank where 40% are founders of businesses, it then shifts quite quickly into the business ownership and prompts discussion on succession and transition at that point as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think irrespective of whether the asset is wealth or a business, it's very important to try and develop an ownership mindset. So there's an understanding, as you've said, what are the responsibilities and expectations that go with being an owner of this wealth or an owner of this business?
And we have the same here. If I think of Schroders as a family enterprise, 220 plus years in, I think we benefit from, similarly to the businesses that you've been advising, insofar as we can take the long-term view on our strategy, but it does align us with those business owner clients.
What do you think that 220 years in business as a family enterprise brings to your clients?
Well, I think the family culture certainly pervades, and people talk about that a lot. And I think newcomers into our business feel, they do say it feels different to non-family enterprise wealth management houses and asset managers that they've been part of. And we take that and also the family's values. You know, they've put the client first for 220 years. I think that's been really useful to sustain as a pillar for us in our corporate values.
And just to add to that, I think the long-term mindset that comes with a family business that intends to remain a family business allows you to take decisions that are best for 10, 20, 30 years. And when you're in a business like ours, which is wealth and asset management, we are taking a long-term view with all of our clients. So it marries those two things very neatly together, I think, which is genuinely in the best interest of our clients, but also it makes it for a better place to work for us as well.
Yeah, I think we've talked a bit about the opportunities and the advantages of family enterprise. And I think you mentioned earlier the risks. And for me, the main risks, and I'm sure I'd like to know if you see this yourselves, is that planning is built on assumption. So there's not been enough communication and engagement across the ownership group base, across the generations, and a plan has been developed without any real input from others.
And I think successful alignment across generations of values and purpose for the business to build a strategy for the future is really important. But you've got to bring all those stakeholder voices to the table and manage the different views, which may not always be collaborative. And do you think there's a blueprint, once you've handled the first generation to the second generation, do you think there is a blueprint for success that takes you beyond that? So there's already an experience of a generational transition. If there isn't a formal framework, how do they then go about thinking about that Gen 2 to Gen 3 or 3 and beyond?
I think governance has a big role to play. I think in the beginning, in Generation 1 and founder-led businesses, as you will know, there's often not even a board of directors. And so as businesses evolve to Generation 2, that'll be the first thing. It will be business or corporate governance. And beyond that, typically there will be family governance emerging, a family charter, a constitution, a family council, possibly even a family office, depending on the wealth created, where the owners manage their relationship with one another and their relationship with the business. So I think that's the framework that helps give backbone to continuity. Also, sometimes mistakes have been made, and we all learn from those.
And Mairi, in your experience, are there more people making plans prior to death today than there were previously, where historically a founder or a founding family member who has control of the reins would plan for their mortality only and not think about bringing family members into the business or engaging with them ahead of time?
Many entrepreneurs actually say to me they're going to live forever.
Yeah.
So in answer to that, yes, people are, partly to do with the BPR relief changes. And I welcome the conversation about shareholder transition occurring during lifetime rather than at death. I do think it will help tease apart the difference, the constant conflation between leadership and ownership transition, and it will make people plan for them separately, as should be the case anyway, as good practice. But yes, just like you said, I think there's still an opportunity, given the timescales, for these changes, for the detail to come through, for technical advice to be sought. And then I would say the next stage of that process is to communicate and share those findings with shareholders, with other owners, and then probably a process of education. Not everyone comes to the table equally in an ownership group, understanding what they're being told technically, and then from there making decisions about the future in a considered and collective manner. It's number one on the agenda of most of my clients today.
Mairi, thank you very much for your time today. And thank you very much for watching. To discuss any of the issues raised in the video, please do get in touch.